It's ironic that I'm speaking to you now via the internet rather than in person, because one of the points underlying this talk is the importance of human contact. Since the COVID pandemic turned everybody's life upside down, we've all become familiar with attending meetings and talks online. But as things relaxed, I think we began to realize how much we missed the personal connections we'd taken for granted with family, friends, and the people we work with. An image on a screen can convey quite a lot, but it's no substitute for the interaction which takes place between two human beings in a face-to-face personal encounter. Personal interaction is essential for growth. For a monk, that assumes special importance, because monastic life, indeed all community life, is an opportunity for a loving encounter here on earth with the reality of the God in heaven that we cannot see. Or, as it's put in chapter 4 of the first letter of John, a man who does not love the brother he can see cannot love God, whom he has never seen. So anyone who loves God must also love his brother. And it's because of this that a monk hopes that after a lifetime of these encounters, he may eventually run on the path of God's commandments, our hearts overflowing with the inexpressible delight of love, to quote the conclusion of the prologue to the Rule of St. Benedict. The title of this talk is Why Be a Monk in the 21st Century? And there's a Spanish saying which translates, if you want to know me, come and live with me. Given the restrictions of time and place, what I'd like to do instead today is talk to you about my life as a monk and to demonstrate why I think the monastic life remains a particular and important witness to the enduring reality of spiritual values, values which are so often drowned out by the mesmerizing attractions of a materialistic world which caters for every physical need, but ignores the fact that we human beings are so much more complex than we appear on the surface. First of all, I'll place the monastic life in its historical context, then go on to the vows and the life itself, finishing with a few thoughts on what I think the monastic witness still has to offer to the wider life of the Church. The first person recorded as living what we would now term the monastic life is generally held to be St. Anthony of Egypt. He was born towards the end of the 3rd century, and at the age of 20, he sold all his possessions and became a solitary hermit for about 20 years. Eventually, he was persuaded to act as a guide to a number of disciples who'd gathered around him, forming what might be called one of the first recorded monastic communities. A desire to place God at the center of their lives was what motivated these early monks, to try and suffuse life here on earth with the quality of the life to come. And at first, they tried to do this in the solitude of the desert. But it didn't take wise men and women long to realize that you've got to be pretty tough to cope with being alone if you're not to fall prey to the self-delusion and end up more than a little unbalanced. So anyone who successfully survived the desert experience naturally attracted followers, keen to get a few helpful tips. That brings us to St. Benedict. The world into which he was born in the late 5th century was a very hostile one. Roman civilization was collapsing in Gaul, the Vandals were pillaging Africa, the Goths had begun to attack Italy, Rome had fallen to Alaric in 410 and had been sacked again by the Vandals in 455. The deposing of the last Roman emperor in 476 was followed by a long period of war up and down the Italian peninsula between the Byzantine and Ostrogoth armies. It was to Rome in this turbulent and chaotic period that the young Benedict was sent to study. After a while, he could take its decadence no longer, and he headed for the hills outside Rome to Subiaco to become a hermit. Like St. Anthony, he attracted a number of followers, and eventually he left his solitude to set up a number of communities, finishing with a great one at the top of Monte Cassino in about 529, about the same time as down on the plains, the war continued its destruction. It was also about this time that he set about writing his Little Rule for Beginners, as he calls it in the final chapter. One of St. Benedict's titles is Patron Saint of all Europe, a title given to him in 1964 by Pope Paul VI, possibly in recognition of the role played down the centuries by Benedictine monasteries in preserving much of Western civilization from destruction during the Dark Ages. This, of course, wasn't exclusive to Benedictine monasteries. Other religious orders also played a significant part. We've only got to look at the Dominicans and the Franciscans, at the contribution of prominent figures such as St. Bonaventure, St. Thomas Aquinas, and St. Catherine of Siena. But the particular Benedictine vow of stability, a commitment to living in the monastery of your profession for the rest of your life, that enabled Benedictine monasteries to act as storehouses of learning and culture at a time when these were endangered elsewhere by the deterioration of social structures. The high walls of a monastery hidden away on a remote mountaintop or in an isolated valley, far away from the war and strife of the towns, must have seemed a haven for which it was worth sacrificing a lot. Of course, then as now, there will have been some who joined the monastery for the wrong reasons, for perceived economic and social advantages and financial security, rather than for a desire to grow closer to God. Monastic life has a way of weeding these out, because in the early years in particular, there's a lot to put up with which tests the spirits. And if you're there for the wrong reasons, it's hard to cope with all that, especially if you have a perceptive novice master. I'd like now to move on to the rule itself. It's a slim volume written in about the mid-6th century, but based on a much longer and slightly earlier work known as the Rule of the Master. There are just 73 short chapters, some of which are clearly less applicable today, and others which are still as fresh and relevant to human relations as they ever were. Benedict begins by telling us that there are 4 kinds of monks. The Cenobites, who live in monasteries under the guidance of an abbot. Anchorites, or hermits, tested in community life and now ready, with God's help, to grapple single-handed with the vices of body and mind on their own. The Sarabites, who live in small towns or singly, but who follow no rule except what they want to do. And finally, the Gyrovagues, always on the move, drifting from place to place, slaves to their own wills and appetites. Benedict shows where his sympathies lie by declaring that his rule is intended for the strong kind, the Cenobites. He realizes that rules are essential for the smooth running of a monastery, but his compassion and humanity come through in a readiness to encourage the abbot to interpret these according to the temperament of the individuals in his care. And it's this compassion and adaptability which, in large measure, give the rule its continuing relevance, success, and popularity. One of my favorite passages, advising the abbot, is, "He must so arrange things that the strong may have something to strive for, but the weak will not draw back in alarm." And also, he should avoid rubbing a vessel too hard, lest in trying to remove the rust, he break the vessel. Both of those come from the chapter on the election of the abbot, and it lays down the qualities a community should look for in the man that they think might make a good leader. Now let's look briefly at the 3 vows monks take. Traditionally, Benedictine monks take 3 vows: stability, obedience, and conversatio morum. Starting in reverse order, that final vow, conversatio morum, has proved difficult to translate, so scholars, on the whole, leave it in Latin. Conversion of manners is the best they've come up with, but that doesn't really convey a desire to wake up each day with a fresh and radical commitment to remain open to the action of the Holy Spirit, letting God guide us through the events of that day towards a deeper acceptance that is through constant interaction with those around us that we can become better people. If, of course, you are genuinely trying to lead a better life as a monk, then poverty and chastity are unavoidable. So it might be said that conversatio morum includes those two. Obedience is the next vow, and is pretty straightforward, although it's one of the most difficult ones for young people today who are accustomed to doing what they like from an early age. In a world which values self-expression and the freedom to do what we want, obedience seems an undesirable and outmoded restriction on our growth as an individual. It's particularly difficult when you're told by someone senior to you to do something you know is incorrect or just doesn't make sense. But obedience can also be very liberating because it frees us from having to make choices about many of the things in life which are quite frankly unimportant, leaving us free to concentrate on the one really important thing, spiritual growth, which in the long run is what will make us more serene, contented, and fulfilled human beings. And when we're asked to do things we don't want to do, well, as the saying goes, welcome to the real world. Workplaces and homes are full of people making decisions about others which turn out to be wrong. It's how we deal with life setbacks throughout the course of life that's important, again and again and again. Because paradoxically, we only grow and become better people during times of testing and difficulty. And that's true not just of monastic life, but of just about any relationship I can think of. And so we come to the final vow, stability. A rolling stone gathers no moss is a very true saying. Anything that's constantly on the move, whether it's an individual or an institution, has no opportunity to develop properly. That's particularly true of human relationships. If you look at large cities where the population is always on the move, there's no chance to deal with and confront problems. It's too easy to run away from them, thinking that things will be different elsewhere. Which is why Benedict saw the crucial importance of the vow of stability for his monks. Within the walls of the monastery, strengthened by their vow of stability, both the weak and the strong find something to strive for, persevering in monastic life with the same brethren until death. That was Benedict's vision of how human beings could develop if they were given a stable environment, bearing with each other's weaknesses and in patience and love, trying to reflect among themselves in the monastery the love God has for each individual of his creation. Pope Benedict XVI once said that St. Benedict's choice of the top of Monte Cassino as the location for his greatest monastery was symbolic. Just as Monte Cassino dominates the plains below, monastic life, he said, has its raison d'être in withdrawal and concealment. But a monastery also has a public role in the life of the church and of society. This is particularly true of the divine office, the daily round of prayers which brings a monk into church several times a day, consecrating the whole day to God and punctuating it with prayer. As the chant gradually works its magic, helping to refocus and restore sense of what's really important, problems are kept in perspective and become less burdensome. It's also a very powerful witness and sign to a materialistic world of the existence of something greater. 44 years ago, I was looking for something to make me want to get out of bed in the morning, to fire me with enthusiasm and bring fulfillment and meaning to life. Without knowing it, I was searching for a place for God in my life. And that's a search we will approach in our own particular way throughout our lifetime. From monk or nun, it's done within the framework of monastic life. Others do it by marrying or remaining simple or adopting any one of a variety of careers. If it works for you, then it's the right path. The variety of its gifts is the Church's strength. The public role of the monastery is to act as a witness that there are alternative values to those of our consumer society. And it does that by showing that a community of men from a great variety of backgrounds and abilities can share material possessions and live in relative harmony despite occasional differences because of their faith and belief in God. Over the years, charity and patience are tested as we knock the rough edges off each other and are gradually transformed into what we hope is something closer to the goal of perfection to which all God's creation is called. The judgments and mistakes we make about people and which later we come to regret are an opportunity for others to show forgiveness and patience, while at the same time make us realize our need to be as generous with others. Of course, there's disappointment and frustration, and learning to accept that we aren't the authors of our destiny isn't easy. Being in control is something that we all value highly. But true serenity will only come when we finally entrust our lives with all its ups and downs to God, knowing that only He can take our human failings and turn them into something more wonderful than we could ever have imagined. The monastic family and its work is a testimony to that transforming power, giving positive meaning to life here on earth while witnessing to something greater, something yet to come, a witness still needed by our world. I'd like to finish with a short quotation from Jonathan Sacks's book, Celebrating Life, a series of appreciations of the lives of prominent public figures. This is the end of the chapter on Cardinal Hugh. He writes, "Truth is best taught not by theology, but by personal example. God needs living witnesses. We're all living witnesses. May you receive every blessing and happiness in whatever you're called to do."